Welcome, Felicia, to the Flower Podcast.
Hey Scott, I'm so happy to be here. Excited to finally talk to you today.
I know I've really been looking forward to this, and I have followed you for a little while on social media and stuff, and I just really I don't know, you just seem like you have so many facets to your business that I can't wait to talk more about that and hopefully maybe inspire some farmers and help people understand what you do.
Yeah, it's exciting. I know I sometimes look at my list every day and I think, gosh, how did I end up doing all how did I end up with all this stuff? But yeah, I'm a busy lady.
Well, okay, so we always like to start at the beginning. And I'm all curious. Okay, so when did your journey and how did your journey into growing cut flowers or roses? How did it all begin?
So, it's kind of my journey into cut flowers was kind of again more of a fortuitous one. I've been farming pretty much my whole life. I grew up on the farm I actually now live on. My grandparents, they grew French prunes and rice and nuts and other deciduous trees. We had a commercial prune dehydrator, and I still actually grow all those things as well. Went away to college, studied agriculture, ended up in the vineyard and wine industry for a long time. My husband and I owned a winery and a vineyard. And several years ago, decided to kind of leave that part of the business behind and move back up to the home that I grew up in and the farm that I grew up on. And I never intended, to be quite honest, to grow cut flowers. And my husband was a transplant. He didn't grow up in this little town, which is kind of funny because everybody here's all, he's the outsider in the small town. And he had, got a job locally and was, meeting new people. And there was a guy that he met through his work that was a floral designer and happened to just come out to the farm one day to pick up something. And he saw me outside, and my grandmother had this collection of old garden roses that she's had for years. Some of them are found roses from the Gold Rush area. They've been on the property for a long time, from when I was a kid. And he just goes, these roses are absolutely gorgeous. He goes, they're really popular these days. They're becoming more popular, at the SF Flower Mart. Have you ever thought about selling them? And I was like, well, no, like this region, this area where I grow is not known for cut flower production at all, let alone field grown roses. And I said, I really hadn't. And really, he kind of put that bug in my ear. And I said, well, you would really buy these, and what do you do with them? And that was sort of the spark. So that's how I got into it. And so, sort of long story short, I started selling some of my grandma's old roses, and then eventually expanded into full grown cut flower production, different varieties and things than what were here originally. But that's how it started. The farm just now has one more crop, which is garden roses, and I do some tulips and other stuff too. But most people know me for my roses.
Sure, sure. So, do you know the names of the varieties that were sort of, on the property for so
Some of them
long?
I do, and a good number of them I don't. I'll be quite honest, I don't. Like some of them, I mean, I could send them off for genetic testings. I've asked, older Rosarians from the area, especially up in the Gold Country, that might know, and the old historic cemetery here in Sacramento that has a lot of older roses. That's actually going through the city took it back over again, kind of a long story, but the foundation that kind of helped preserve the roses is no longer involved. But a lot of those people, I've asked over the years, hey, what do you think this is? And a lot of them I don't know what they are. Which is, again, it's kind of the fun part. And those are ones I'll be honest, I don't really sell. Like they're the ones I kind of save for. They're my yard, they're my garden, that's where my kids play. And some of them really aren't as great as cut flowers. They shatter a little, and their petals aren't as sturdy as they need to be for production. But it was just nice that they were kind of the catalyst that got me into that part of the business of growing and producing garden roses.
Sure, that's really cool. I just think it's so neat to have like these sort of, I don't know, heritage varieties. I don't know what to call them, but things that, are these I don't know, historical plants that, it's fun to find out someday. Maybe someday you'll be able to, because I think that's
Yeah,
neat. And I
one
wish.
day I'll finally map them all.
So, all right. Well, so how much land do you grow on?
The all of the property altogether isn't all in one location, but it's roughly a little over 100 acres. So it's but the cut flower production is, to be honest, a really kind of small slice of that. It's about 3 acres. And then I have about another 2 acres that's in production just for bare root roses. So for the growing and then harvesting and selling of bare roots.
Hmm. Well, I was wondering because when I interviewed Danny for our podcast at Rose Story Farm, very early on the podcast, you and her were like getting ready to have sort of like your first, like maybe it wasn't the first, but you guys were going to host some kind of an educational event at her farm.
Yeah, we did host one. I don't remember where it was where your podcast came out in the cycle, but we did host one. It was called The Gathering Rose. And it was she and I came together really as a way to share our love of roses with other floral designers, aspiring flower farmers. It was all essentially scholarship based, that we had essays, blind essays submitted, and we picked people, and we did one in, I'm going to forget that we did one in 2019. I think 2019 was the first one, and then we had another one scheduled for 2020 in March of 2020, and we were just getting ready to announce the winners and doing actually it might have been April. I think we were doing it in April that year, like the first or second week of April of 2020, and then COVID came, and we had to cancel, and so we didn't end up getting to do the second one. And then we haven't really revisited that, actually, I think just because events and everything else, not really knowing what was happening. And to be honest, all of us in the flower world, I'm sure you know this, the last couple of years, kind of once events started again, we all sort of went into overdrive. There wasn't a lot of time for, for us to kind of slow down in that spring season and do a kind of a joint event. So but yeah, the first one we did was really great, and we were looking forward to the one in 2020 as well. It was a really special experience down at her farm of education and just a nice coming together of a lot of really great people.
Well, I love the idea that it was scholarship based, and I just think I know when we spoke with Danny, and I'm curious your thoughts. I because of different parts of the country having so many different climates or microclimates, I'm excited to see little pockets of people starting to grow more garden roses for their local communities, their local florists and events and things. Have you seen an uptake in that? I mean, especially that you're selling bare roots. Are you seeing more of that?
Absolutely. I would say, again, selling the bare roots, a lot of my customers are smaller flower farms that they want to grow in, really any zone 3, 4, 5, like zones that you wouldn't think that you would grow in. I also have a learning academy, and I've always done workshops here at the farm, but during COVID, we had to cancel all those. So I took it online, and because I did that, now I have kind of a wider range of people that come and learn with me. And a lot of the people that seek out cooler that maybe aren't always known for garden roses, and I mentor them into how can you do it in a tunnel? How can you do it in a greenhouse? What other changes can you make to your cultural practices so that you can actually grow these same beautiful roses? Everybody always says, we want to grow the roses like you guys do in California. And so I try to help people, regardless of zone, essentially do that. Try to make it. So I absolutely think there is an uptake, and I think it's fantastic. We kind of were talking a little bit before we started recording about shipping, and shipping can be a big challenge in the flower world, even pre-COVID. But now, it really is trying to get something somewhere on time that's a fresh product that's perishable. So I think it's fantastic. The more local you can get your flowers, I think the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just know it's been kind of crazy because I know, like, you hear warmer climates like here in the South. You think kind of like California, like you could grow like a longer season. But I also know because of the humidity and the moisture, we have a lot of disease things. Issues that I don't believe you have, or like Danny or whoever has, just because of the drier climate. But I don't know. It's just interesting, and I'm excited to see it. I'm curious, through your academy, do you really kind of dig into that? Like, I'm just curious some of the issues that you have noticed that rose growers are facing?
The academies, I have different kind of learning opportunities in the academy. So it's not kind of a monolith, but I have three membership levels, and every level, it kind of goes from, people that are just kind of dipping their toe in, that just, want some basic resources, to my higher level membership. We meet once a month and we talk exactly about these things. We go live on Zoom and the whole group goes together. We talk about successes and failures. And then I also do one-on-one consulting as well. So I would say, really just kind of more with my one-on-one clients, or with that kind of higher level membership in my academy. Those people really are looking for kind of those resources of the how can I do what you do? Like, how do I deal with humidity? And we work on, variety selection and those types of things that maybe it's not exactly what I grow here. And it really is about the, right rose. I always say right rose, right place, right time. That
Yeah.
it's, everything we grow here in California might not grow well there. And likewise, things that grow well in the South, aren't necessarily going to grow well in my climate. So it's kind of about helping them get through cultural practices and learning the basics of, rose anatomy and breeding and all of that, so that they can make the best selections, not just in varieties, but also just in how they do their day-to-day rose care. So I would say, yes, there's a definite uptick and definite interest in those things, and more people wanting to do it, and doing it successfully, which I think is great.
Sure. I'm curious. I know a lot of times with import roses that I know firsthand just that there's a lot of different chemicals that are being applied. How do you approach that?
I think in terms of my own field, I approach it as I do the least restrictive. Like, I try not to use any chemicals if I can. And if I do, I try to mostly use all organic products. And I do the same really for the people that I coach as well. I kind of tell them the same thing, like, try the least restrictive, and then go to kind of the most restrictive type of practice. And some of that may not even be chemicals. It may be predatory insects. It may
Hmm.
be a cultural practice, like covering your roses or covering the buds with a tarp. It could be if you have a lot of, in fact, I was consulting with somebody, a grower in Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and they have really bad Japanese beetle problems and really bad bug problems. And they finally decided they were actually just going to start growing in a tunnel and putting up some bug screens and doing some other things, because remaining organic was really important to them. So it was about, how do we implement those cultural practices for, where you are to handle your bugs, so that they don't need to spray. Because even organics, I think people always get stuck on, oh, well, is it organic? But, organic sprays are still sprays, and they're
Right.
still, chemicals as well. So my own philosophy is I try to use the least restrictive thing that I can, and I've been really successful in doing that. That said, a couple years ago, we had a really bad flooding season. Here we went from like floods to drought. Like, our weather here was kind of, didn't know what it was going to do year to year. And that year that we had a lot of rain in the springtime, we had a lot of powdery mildew and a lot of other fungal diseases that we don't typically have. And my normal, organic options just didn't work. And that year I did use, a synthetic chemical product for about 2 weeks. So, I guess I would say I'm definitely not, I would say I'm not 100% organic, and which is why I always leave that door open to, you never know what you're going to need until you need it. But I try the best I can to not have to go to that route,
Right.
if at all possible.
Sure. So is there anything different you do for growing bare root roses versus cut roses? Like, how do you treat the plants differently?
Well, I don't have to worry about the blooms at that point, and they're just not grow. They're not grown as long. So like an own root plant is in the ground for roughly a little over a year, and it's basically just like a cell cutting of that plant, and it just goes in rows like you would plant broccoli or lettuce or anything else, and you're just raising the plant essentially at that point. And yeah, I don't have to do a lot of chemical control or insects, because I'm not as concerned. I don't really care if a bug eats the leaf. as
Right.
long as it's not defoliating, or as long as the insect or disease damage isn't causing enough damage to affect the quality of the plant. It's kind of that, the Joni Mitchell song, like, leave me the spots on my apples, give me the birds and the bees. Like, it's okay if there's a few spots. Same with the grafted roses, it's roughly the same. So, and I'm not concerned about, is the bud perfect? Is the stem perfect? I mean, that's really where with cut flowers, you're concerned about, like the thrips. I pretty much curse at the thrips daily. Like, I start now and it doesn't end until November when our season ends. And I'm just like, are they out there? What are they doing? I'm looking for them everywhere. Whereas with the bare roots, I'm not as concerned about the insect population as much. So I would say that production's a lot easier. It's kind of, I say it's kind of similar. If anybody's familiar with like seed production in plants, like if you grow zinnia seeds, you're not as concerned about, is it the perfect zinnia? And is it turgid and stiff to harvest? And because you're growing it for seeds. So
Right.
you're not as concerned as much about the diseases and insects and things. You're concerned about, how's your seed crop looking? So yeah, the metrics for what I consider a good bare root is different than what I consider a good cut flower plant.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I always wondered, how long does it take to get a plant grown up to sell as bare root? That's interesting. I didn't realize it was that
For
quick.
a grafted rose, it's roughly about 2 years, a little over 2 years. And then an own root plant, a full size own root is that's bare root, is a little over a year. And then there's other, not ones I grow, but there's other, rose producers in the US that will sell like 1 gallon potted plants that are banded like rose cuttings. So it really kind of just depends on what the plant is, how
Hmm.
long it takes to its finished product, depending on what it is.
All right, so I have to ask this question because you brought up thrips, and I know that's one of those critters that creates a lot of devastation. What do you use to control that? Is that a biological or is that something else?
The thrips, I do use organic sprays for that. I kind of have to decide in season what I'm going to do based on the population in the spring.
Hmm.
And typically we have a really wet winter with a lot of green grass growing out in the fields, and then I have a higher thrip population. If we've had a drier winter, the thrips are a little bit lower. So on high population years, it starts really in the winter season with dormant sprays. So I will do a copper spray, a fuller copper spray with a mineral oil. And I will usually do that 2 different sprays, roughly about 2 weeks apart on the entire field. And that's kind of like the first line of defensive prevention. In fact, that's something that we're doing now, like we've been doing the last couple of weeks in the field after we've pruned. And that's kind of step one. And then once I start to see buds just first forming, the first little signs of flower buds, if it's in a wet season, I will usually do sprays, and I use an organic spray called spinosad, and I will rotate that with a neem oil, which is also organic. And if it is a dry year, then I will sometimes go with a biological predatory insect called a Swartsky mite. It's a little mite that actually eats the thrips. But that is a little bit, that again, I have to be really careful when I use those, because then I can't use any other sprays, organic or otherwise, or neem oil, because it will kill the beneficial insects. So I have to make sure that I have a high enough population of the insect of the mites to be able to control the thrips. And that means I have to continue to buy them in, and it can be pretty costly. Sometimes it gets a little cost prohibitive. It also works really well in greenhouses, which I don't grow in. And the thrips and the mites usually work a little better in a closed system, which is a greenhouse system or closed, where you can actually keep them all kind of in their own little bubble. I grow in an open field, so those mites kind of go everywhere. So it sometimes isn't as effective, which is why I tend to use that only on years that I have a smaller population of thrips. Or again, I always recommend it to clients that do grow in greenhouses, or especially in colder climates and all their roses are in tunnels. The mites are a fantastic control for thrips.
Hmm. That's wonderful. And being that it's so funny. It's been a while since I've had a Rosarian. I don't. Do you call yourself Rosarian?
Oh, I'm not a Rosarian. I don't have the official qualifications. I haven't taken all the exams and tests, and I have not done that.
That's
I'm not
okay.
an official Rosarian.
That's okay. I was just curious because, being in, my world in wholesale, it's always interesting because I get people, and I want to get your opinion on this. I get people who ask for, hybrid roses, tea roses, garden roses. They have all these different classifications. And I've always wondered, and I should know the answer to this, but because I think there's some personal opinion that floats in those descriptions. Um, what do you think is the difference between those different categories?
So some of them technically are classifications. If you're talking about garden roses, like by the American Rose Society, there actually is classifications by type of rose for roses grown in a garden. And then those are different than kind of, I think, a little bit what you're talking about wholesale, that might be greenhouse roses that are, maybe called spray roses, or sometimes they're called a garden type rose.
Right.
Then that's really more a descriptor than a classification. So in the garden rose world, the actual classifications, like by the American Rose Society, are hybrid teas, or the ones that are usually grown as cut flowers, are hybrid teas, which is a type of a classification of rose, grandiflora, which is a classification of rose, floribunda is a classification, climbers are a classification, and then shrub roses. And then you throw English roses in there, which people always will say English rose, which really means roses bred by David Austin, which technically aren't a classification per the technical classification terms. They're actually, David Austin roses are all technically shrub roses, but most people call them English roses. So I can see where, you're saying people get confused, because some of them are really more just descriptors, and some of them actually are technical classifications of roses that are used. And then you throw, garden roses that are grown in a field that are actually true garden roses that are grown as cut flowers, are also different than varietal cultivars that are grown in greenhouse production. So you throw that all together in the mix, like if you're at a wholesale house and you're like, what is the difference? And the reality is, it is confusing. I mean, it's even confusing, or not confusing for me, but it's confusing for me to sometimes explain to people that these are actual classifications, and these are just, like descriptions, like just like saying
Right.
something's, large. Like this is just called a spray rose just because it looks like a spray. It's not an actual, classification. It just looks like a spray. So
Sure.
I hope that probably cleared it up as clear as mud for you. But
Well, it's all
but
good.
basically, I just tell people, just find somebody that knows what you're looking for. Find a great sales rep, or find someone that knows flowers like you, and just say, hey, here's what I'm looking for. Send a picture, and they'll find you something that matches.
That's right. As
And
best
don't
we
worry so
can.
much about what it's called.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I can embrace that wholeheartedly. So, okay, great. Well, I was wondering, to me, part of the trick, for people who are maybe delving into growing roses for the first time or are still trying to figure it out, cut stage to me is such an important part of of delivering a product to a florist, to somebody who's going to work with a cut stem. How do you, and that may depend on the variety, but how do you know when to cut your roses?
So it does really depend on the variety, because some varieties open up more quickly than others, and it depends on where you live and your growing area too. Like in the summertime here, when I know it's going to be hot and 100 degrees, I know a rose is going to open in like an hour or less. Whereas if I'm cutting that rose in October, it might take another day for that rose to open. So weather is a factor, but in general, in terms of how to pick a garden rose at the proper cut stage, is you really want to look at the sepals. And if you look at the rose, you've got your petals in your bloom, or what people call the petals in the bloom. And then on the bottom, there's that kind of, green part that wraps around, that usually has 5 little green kind of almost flame looking things that encase the bottom of the bud. And that entire thing is called the calyx. And each individual kind of little fire looking thing is called a sepal. And you want to look, if you're harvesting out in your rose field, you want to look and make sure that 3/4 of the sepals have started to drop. Now, they don't have to be completely pushed all the way down, but they need to start separating from the bloom or separating from the bud. And when about 3/4 of them have started to push away and drop, then it's okay to harvest that rose. And that would be the appropriate time to harvest that rose. If the calyx are all dropped and the flower has started to open, most likely, especially with garden roses, because they are high in pollen, fragrance, and scent, and pollinators absolutely love them. A pollinator will go in there, will pollinate it, and the moment it's pollinated, that's almost like a death sentence for it in terms of a cut flower, because it's going to immediately shatter as soon as you pick it. Like, it's not going to have a long base life at all. So it's really important to watch those sepals and make sure your bloom is nice and tight. And I always tell people this because pollinators surprisingly will get in, they sneak in and out, and like you don't even know they've been there. So really looking at those sepals makes a big difference. Of course, there's always exceptions to every rule. Like, there's a handful of the English roses, some of the David Austins, where it's really hard to tell when the sepals drop. Like, they like to stay nice and tight. And so that's where kind of, again, depending on variety, you kind of learn a little bit of the nuance of each one once you start harvesting. But good rule of thumb is when 3/4 of those sepals have started to reflex down, then that's the proper time to harvest.
Well, that's a great tip. And I didn't realize once the pollinators got in there that the show was over, so to speak. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I had no idea.
Because it's the signal to the plants to start reproducing. So it thinks, oh, now I've got to make a seed. I've got to go make a plant baby. Essentially, is what it says, and it'll start dropping its petals so it can make that seed head.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong. I tell people, especially home gardeners, especially, like, I mean, we're talking cut flower trade and people that want long base life and it's got to go to a wholesaler. And that's kind of a whole different beast than somebody that just wants to pick something out of their yard.
Sure.
If someone wants to pick something, you can absolutely cut a flower that's been opened. It's just not going to last very long. Like, that's the one that's going to sit on your table for, a day and a half, and if that, and it'll be spent. You're not going to get a 5 to 7 day base life, out of that one that you've picked that's already open.
Maybe that explains why sometimes when you get like garden roses shipped in, and you'll have, I don't know, like sometimes there's 10 stems in a bunch. Sometimes if they're kind of small, somebody will put 15 stems in a bunch. And some of them kind of don't last, like they'll shatter right away. Maybe that's why. Maybe they've been pollinated, and that's just part of nature doing its thing. And it's hard to know that.
It could be they pollinated. Sometimes it's hydration issue too. Like, if they haven't, or cooled, like if they've been too hot. I mean, post harvest care, this in the flower world, that temperature has the greatest effect on base life and stem life.
Yeah.
So if they've been harvested and been in a hot barn or a hot truck, or and they haven't been properly cooled from the time they're harvested till they reach the end user, all through the supply chain, that greatly affects whether or not they're going to shatter or open as well. Also, I've done a lot in the last couple of years research on moisture in the soil, and I've really worked a lot on my soil moisture and making sure that it's dialed in at all times. That making sure that my soil moisture in turn makes sure that the plant has enough moisture, and you've got those nice turgid, plump stems. So if you're harvesting a stem that's already hydrated, it's going to last longer than a stem that was like going into some minor drought stress because maybe it didn't have enough water. So I think that's a lot of things too. I would say probably growers that are new to growing garden roses, especially, but as cut flowers or just really anything like dahlias or anything else, the time of day you harvest and how far it is from when you've actually done your irrigation also makes a difference in the end product and the end, how long of that base life it's going to have.
Well, since you put that out there, what is the ideal situation, like when to water and when to harvest? I know it probably depends on the weather and temperatures and things.
That really depends on, yeah, it does. It depends on your weather and your soil type. Like, that is an answer I can't give a generic, answer to, because sandy soils, you're going to want to water more clay soils, you're watering less. But
sure,
in general, you want to harvest early in the morning when it's cooler weather, and you just want to make sure that you have the appropriate moisture in your soil, so that the plant isn't getting stressed at any point during its growing time. so that you're not going from like, let's say you're watering on Monday and then you don't water all week until Friday. In between, your plant's probably going to get stressed at some point. I always tell people, because they're like, well, how do I know? I'm like, well, what happens if you drank water on Monday and then didn't drink watering until Friday? Your body would be kind of parched too, and your skin's kind of tight, and you look like you need a facial. Like your plants, need the same thing.
Right.
So, you got to kind of think of it in those terms. But yeah, I can't give generic watering advice because
I
it is
know.
like so weather and everything related. But in general, keep your plants well watered and harvest early in the morning is the best time.
Yeah, that really wasn't a fair question, and I should have known better. Let me ask this. Let me ask this question. Obviously, we have a lot of listeners that are wedding and event florists, and I know that it always makes me sad when people, like yourself, are growing amazing roses. You put everything you have into this flower. When you put it in the box, it's obviously pretty, right? And then you ship it, and then they get it. And I just like tips for processing. What do you recommend for taking those beauties out of the box to have the greatest opportunity for success?
I think this is really challenging, and I think it's one of the areas that as growers, at least I'm trying to be better about as a grower, do more education just like this. So I'm glad you asked me this question, because a lot of times I will, especially if they've gone in a box, like if there's somebody who's local and they're getting a delivery from us in a bucket, that's a little bit different. When they go
Right.
in the box, they've gone through some stress. Like when they're going in a box overnight FedEx, like, they've got a little stress. The number one thing is, and I know florists get really busy, or floral designers get busy, and I understand this, but I've heard some of them go, oh, I didn't get to them till yesterday, and that box has been sitting there for like a day and a half. Garden roses cannot sit there for a day and a half. Like
Oh my gosh.
you have to get those things out of the, like whatever you're doing when that box arrives, stop and open it up. Like they're going to be your most temperature sensitive, delicate, like they're your divas. Like, and you've got to treat them as such. So like I would say the first thing is, whenever that box arrives, like get them out of the box, get them into a hydrator and water solution, and get them into a cooler. I think that's a challenge too for floral designers. A lot of them, especially if they're home studio designers, may not have a cooler, and a cooler makes a huge difference in the vase life for garden roses. If you don't have a cooler, put it in the coolest, darkest location you have, like the bottom of a closet or something, but you want to get them out of light and you want to get them into a cool location. Ideally a 34-degree cooler with hydrator and water. As soon as you receive them, let them hydrate for at least 4 hours, but 24 hours is better. Then pull them out and then let them open, and you'll see that they don't look as sad as they probably did when they arrived, because you've given them that hydrating time and that cooling time. Their respiration is slowing down. But I would say, keep them cool, get them hydrated. Don't leave them in that box, please. Please, as a grower, I'm begging you, get them out as quickly as you can. And then also, sometimes there's just varieties that don't ship well. So there are some I actually grow on the farm and I won't ship them. It doesn't matter how many designers go, oh, but, and because I've just learned that they are not varieties that ship well, and they're delicacies that are meant to be enjoyed locally. And as we were talking about, that's why I like that there's more people growing garden roses now wherever they are across the country, because those are great varieties for designers wherever they may be to find a local grower to hopefully supply for them, because they don't ship well, kind of like dahlias. Like there's a lot of dahlias that aren't
Right.
great at being shipped either.
Right. I love that answer. And then, let me ask this little detail. There are some flowers I feel like when they first come out of the box, like I want them to get cut and hydrated, and I let them drink at room temperature for like a short period of time before I put them in the cooler, because I'm sometimes afraid the cooler is going to slow that hydration process a little bit. So do you worry about that? You just put them in the cooler and don't worry about it? Or do you feel like you should leave them out just a little bit?
With garden roses, I don't worry about it, because that
Okay.
hydrator has the chemicals in it that's going to open up the xylem tissues, that's
Mhm.
going to let it drink, and it's not going to go into as much shock. And again, this also just kind of depends on your location of your studio. Like, is it 70 degrees in there? Is it 80 degrees in there? Like, if
Yeah.
somebody had like a nice 80-degree studio, I would say don't let them drink at room temperature, your studio's temperature. Put them in the cooler because they'll start to open. So with garden roses, I tend to, and I've never seen a marked difference hydrating at room temperature first versus putting them directly into a cooler. I usually tell people get them into that cooler and get them, so because you just, again, for floral designers, they want them to stay as long as they can to get them to that event.
Right.
And so you want to really have them in a state of suspended animation, and getting them into the cooler is the way you do that until you're ready for them to like put on their show. So no, you do it? Yes. I do think it's, again, depending on your studio conditions or your whatever, everybody's room temperature is, kind of different. Is it sunlight? Is it dark? I kind of tend to err on the get it in cold and dark, and because that way you're kind of hedging your bets at that point.
Well, and I think it's easier to time them opening when you pull them out and they wake up all of a sudden, because they get that, warm air hitting them, and then they're like, oh, okay, and then they do their thing. You've mentioned hydration solution, which I think is a big part of garden roses. What do you recommend for that?
Yeah, if you're actually, I use both. I use a couple different kinds of products actually from a couple different companies. So, whoever your sponsors are, I'm sure I'll probably mention one that is. But I use Kreisel Rose Pro Hydration, and then also Floral Life 100 solution. Both of those are great. They're hydrator only. They don't have any sugar or food in them. So they're purely a hydration. So they're not a holding solution. And that's usually what I recommend for garden roses. And that's what I recommend my customers use at the end, because the garden roses, once you start feeding them that sugar, they want to start opening. So for that first step of when you receive them and you get them in the hydrator, in the cooler, I don't want them to have food yet, because I don't want them to open. Once
Sure.
they're ready for them to open, then I usually, and they don't have to, this isn't 100% necessary, but then you can switch to a more of a flower food, like a Floral Life like 300, or the Kreisel Rose Pro liquid. I think they're just called Rose Pro liquid hydration, like that is specifically for roses.
Mm-hmm.
That's a flower food and a hydrator. And you can use that in your bucket when you're waiting for them to open, or that can go into the vase or the compote, for the wedding centerpiece or whatever. But I usually recommend sticking with that hydrator until you're ready to kind of move to that design step.
Now, I know you've grown roses for cut purposes, and so I'm sure you get a lot of demand for certain color palettes. And you're growing bare root roses, which I know we were talking earlier, you're almost sold out, but there's still a few gems left. If you, hopefully when this airs, there might still be some opportunities for people. But I'm curious, again, on the wholesale level, we're definitely still seeing the muddy tones, the quicksand roses, all of these sandy, washed out kind of colors and blushes and whites. Are you seeing the same thing and with what you're doing? And do you grow bare roots to kind of flow with that, or do you just kind of spread it all around?
I would say for cut flowers, yes, those antique muddy tones are still very popular. Whites and creams are always classic. I would say peaches have been pretty popular for weddings and events this last year too, kind of the peachy colors. As far as bare root production, it is a little bit different. It mostly mirrors cut flowers, because most of my customers who buy bare roots, they want to grow for weddings and events. Like they're flower farmers, farmer
Right.
florists, or they're, floral designers who just want to have a few blooms of their own to tuck into their wedding bouquets to supplement what they're getting from a wholesaler or whatnot. So I do have a lot of those kind of traditional tones, but I have a whole nother kind of, I would say another half of my customer base that buys bare root plants that are just home gardeners. And with home gardeners, the brighter colors are really popular. So the yellows, and I actually fall into that category. I love yellow roses. I would plant an entire field of yellow roses if I could, but they're not always as popular for weddings and events. But the brighter colors, the yellows, and surprisingly, more of the reds. A lot of home gardeners like the classic kind of red roses. that they want those kind of long, which for garden roses are not as popular. Like I can't give away red roses, garden roses in the middle of summer because it's, you know, peak wedding season, or even in fall, until it starts getting a little, it's October, the reds get popular again. But you know, August, September, nobody wants a red rose. Like my burgundies sit out there and they're sad because nobody wants to take them home. But the home garden, you know, kind of customer or consumer, they like those yellows, they like the reds. So my balance of bare root production is a little bit different, but I do carry a lot of those. You know, I would say Coco Loco, Honey Dijon have been probably my biggest, I would say my best sellers of bare roots the last 2 years, that home gardeners want those earthy tones too.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so since yellow roses are some of your favorites, let me ask, which yellow roses do you wish there were more in cut production of? Let's go on a campaign to increase yellow roses in the universe. So
Oh yeah, you know, as far as garden roses, I really love, there's one called Moonlight Romantica, which is a great garden rose. It's vigorous and it grows well in almost all zones, which is also why I like to recommend it, because it's kind of foolproof for anyone that wants to get into cut flower growing, regardless of if they're in a, you know, a zone 3 or a zone 10. And it's just really beautiful, bright yellow rose. It's got a nice rosette shape. It looks like a English rose, but it's not. It's actually a German bred rose from Cortis is the breeder. It's a beautiful rose. I really love there's a David Austin rose called Charlotte, and it's kind of this buttery yellow, and the bloom actually almost looks a little bit like a peony. And it's one of my favorites. It actually can be a little more prone to shattering. It's not a great one to ship, but I love the color and I love the rose. What other yellow ones? I like Teasing Georgia. It's a David Austin climbing rose, but it's great as a cut as well. Michelangelo. There's so many yellow ones I like. So many beautiful yellow ones.
well, I think that's great. And I you know, it's interesting because yellow hasn't always been my favorite color, but lately there's been so many interesting color stories and color palettes that I've seen incorporating more yellows and creams and things like that. And so I don't know. That's why I wanted to kind of go there, because I feel like, I don't know, maybe we're going to start a new trend here on the Flower Podcast. We're going to put more yellow roses out into the world.
I know, every year. Every year I'm always waiting. I'm like, okay, when are the yellows going to make their comeback? But again, I love them in my landscape. And I think that's what is different, is that when you drive into somewhere and you see like a bunch of, like, I think white makes a great statement. Like if a driveway is lined with white or a driveway is lined with yellow, it's a beautiful statement. When a driveway is lined with like taupe, it kind of blends into the house. Like it's, you know, those are great roses for cuts because they look beautiful in an arrangement, but when they're kind of in a landscape, they sort of blend in with the surroundings and they don't make as impactful, I think, of a statement, which is why I tend to like yellow ones for the garden, because they kind of brighten up the place.
So I was curious about something, and when I was in California earlier last year, I had the opportunity to visit a few different growers, and it was interesting to see the difference in maybe pruning techniques is maybe the question. Like when I was at Rose Story, I know that her plants tended to be very low to the ground. They tend to not be really big. And in other places, the bushes are bigger and more, you know, heads everywhere. But I mean, I know that maybe that's just a maturity, like the size of the plant, you know, it's older, so it's bigger. But then I know there's pruning, and I don't know. It's interesting. I've never seen that done that way. I'm curious your thoughts.
I think it just probably depends on, you know, time of year. That if it's in the, like now, if you were to come visit my field, we just finished pruning and everything's like, you know, 15 to 18 inches tall. And that looks like, they look like these naked little twigs. And I think some of it comes is soil type, weather and variety. Like some plants are naturally just smaller in stature. Like if you go out to my field, again, Coco Loco is a popular one. Everybody loves that one. Coco Loco is a pretty small plant, and it actually has a very small growth habit. It doesn't get very big. It doesn't get much higher than 3 to 4 feet. It's next to a block of my field that I have Princess Charlene de Monaco, which is this towering, kind of blushy pink hybrid tea. And, I got Coco Loco over here and we harvest off of it every day. I mean, those roses are so popular, stem does
Hmm.
not go untouched. We harvest as often as we can off that. And then Princess Charlene, we're harvesting same thing. And Princess Charlene's 6 feet tall. Coco Loco's, towering over here, maybe at 4. And we treat them the same. So some of it also is just the growth habit of the plant. So if you saw some that were really tall and some that were really short, it could just be the nature and the stature of the plant. And some are taller and some are shorter. And in terms of pruning techniques, it could just be, in my climate, I'm really warm and dry, and like you said, I don't have humidity. Plants thrive here, so I am pretty aggressive with my pruning because my plants will get out of control pretty quickly if I don't. In colder regions or areas of California where you might have a little bit more of the marine influence, or it's a little bit cooler, a little bit foggier, they're not going to grow as rapid of a rate because their high temperatures are a little bit lower than mine. So their plants might be a little bit smaller. But it doesn't mean that the cut flowers aren't, like the stems aren't as long. It's just the plant itself may be a little bit smaller. So, I mean, again, it's kind of a number of factors could affect size, including pruning techniques too.
Well, I know that too. There's sometimes people will go into a plant and they'll cut a longer stem, which then, of course, makes the plant have to kind of takes longer to recover from than cutting shorter stems, maybe. And I also know some varieties just are more prone to having long stems versus short stems. I mean, I know there's a lot of variation there as well. But I was just kind of curious because I was kind of surprised about that. And then I thought, well, in a more humid climate, is it beneficial to have the roses maybe prune them in such a way where there's more airspace between them, or that they're a little bit shorter, or a little more contained? Maybe is that the right word? So anyway, so it was just things I noticed.
Yeah, again, there's so many factors from my earbuds I think just went dead. So let me know if that sounds still okay. But yeah, I think it's so many factors from weather to location to plant type that can really affect the size, to soil. I mean, watering, like it's kind of, there's so many things that can really affect how a garden rose grows. And actually, the lower you cut on the plant or the longer the stem, usually then the longer the next stem is going to grow, which is why most cut flower growers cut really deeply, because that encourages nice long stems. If you cut more shallow, you're going to get a more shallow stem in its place.
Oh, okay, that's helpful. That might be why they did that. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I always there's a couple more things I want to talk about, and one of them is I always like to, as we get towards the end, ask that advice question. And I know since you mentor a lot of other rose growers, you see maybe there's business practices. I don't know, what piece of advice would you like to leave our listeners?
Oh goodness, I always find this an interesting type of question because there's so many different types of advice I could give. But I would say with business, in particular, if you're looking for like business advice, I think a lot of people that are new growers, not just roses, but like maybe new to farming, or maybe they are a floral designer and they're looking to kind of dip their toe into growing some of their own flowers, is that they tend to bite off more than they can chew. And they're too on social media, and they like have a list of 9 million varieties they want to grow and all of these things. And then they try it and they're not as successful because they can't really focus. So I would say my advice in terms of like the business of growing flowers is maybe pick, 1 or 2 varieties, or pick one in each color family that you're interested in. Try them for a year or two, learn how to do it, and then up your volume of plants. Like then go, okay, that one's a good one, it's going to stay. That one I need to replace. Because if you plant more than you can take care of, you're not going to financially recoup your investment, and B, you're probably going to feel really, really defeated, like you're not good at growing roses, which probably isn't the case. You probably just, maybe planted more than you had time to take care of effectively. So I usually tell people to start smaller than they think. That they sometimes have eyes that are bigger than their stomachs, so to speak.
I think that's great advice. And I think and I always wonder, and I know this totally depends on space, if you've got 80 acres or 2 acres versus half an acre, but I'm curious, how many plants does it really kind of take to get a feel for how that plant's going to do? If you plant one, you might not really get a good indication. And you're right. You don't want to plant 100 because you might not recoup your investment if it's a bad fit. I mean, is 10 a good amount? I mean, I don't know. I know it just depends on the space.
I would say yes, it depends on the space. Like if somebody's trying to grow on a patio, you're probably not going to grow 10 plants. So you
Right.
might do one of each. But I say usually at least 5 to 10. Like start with 5 to 10 of a variety, and that way if is it. And that's why I usually tell people, because people usually kind of want to rush in, or like, after the first year, they're like, that one was great. And I'm like, well, wait till next year. Like I usually tell them to give them 1 or 2 years, because you could have, different weather, like one year's a flood, one year's a drought. Like, I mean, look at the weather that's happening across the US right now. It's like an Arctic freeze everywhere. Like you never know what's going to come. And so I would say, especially in plant breeding, plant testing, plant trialing, that's where patience becomes your friend. It's kind of is key, that do that 5 to 10 and give it 1 or 2 years before you make a huge investment. And for some people that might be 10 plants, and some people it might be, they might buy, like you said, they might buy 100. But whatever it is, start with that 5 to 10. And not only are you seeing is the plant good, but you're also seeing, like I said, a lot of times people, when they add roses to something, like they're already a floral designer and they're trying to do that too, like grow and design, and they maybe not have a lot of farming experience. Those are the people that when I mentor, they tend to be really frustrated because of the insects or the this. And I'm like, well, it's because you don't have time, because you're busy on the weekends, designing weddings. That the farming part is kind of its own job in itself. So really, do those cultural practices, make sure you're watering, make sure you got your fertilizer, make sure you're watching your insects, and then you'll be more successful in the long run, rather than feeling kind of defeated and, maybe not having the outcome that you had hoped.
Well, I know you've been just a wealth of information today, and I appreciate that. I also know that in just maybe not even 2 months, a month and a half, 6 weeks, 5 weeks. I don't know exactly when it's being released, and it may be too soon to know, but you have a book coming out. And I'd love to hear kind of what the book is obviously it's all about roses, but is it more of a coffee table book or more of a how-to book?
It is a book about roses, garden roses in particular. It's how to grow garden roses as cut flowers. So it is more of a how-to book, not a coffee table book. And it's releasing on March 10th. And but there's pre-orders now anywhere you buy your books. My website, I have signed copies available to pre-order, but Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, IndieBound, wherever you get your books, it's already available for purchase. And it is a how to grow roses. So a lot of the stuff we actually talked about today is in the book, like how to harvest, when to harvest, my favorite varieties that do well as cuts, the types of roses to grow for cut flowers. So it's not a complete comprehensive encyclopedia or history of roses. It's specifically how to grow roses as cut flowers.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that's going to be incredible. And actually, and March is a great time to have a book like that in your hand. So hopefully everybody will go out and pre-order a copy of it.
Perfect for everybody heading into spring.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's awesome.
Everybody's heading into springtime, and it's I hope it's helpful for everyone. I will have to say my editors, I love them to death, but it would be an even longer book that I had. Like, I was like, there's so much information that people want to know about flowers and, about roses. And so it's a nice, I would say it's a nice, easily digestible book for any level of rose grower, whether you're somebody that has a little bit more experience or somebody that's just starting out. We made it approachable for kind of all levels, with all the basics you need to know to get started with cut garden roses.
That's great. Well, I know we create a page on our website. So if you're listening and you've never been to our website, theflowerpodcast.com, when we have our page, we'll make sure to have a link to that, to your site and to the buying the book there. So anybody who wants to follow along. Well, Felicia, thank you so much for being on the Flower Podcast.
Well, I had a great time, Scott. It was so nice. I don't always get out of the field to do stuff like this. So even with my internet, that I hopefully people can hear me. That is the challenge of living in a rural area. But I had a great time. Thanks for having me, Scott.